Grade 8, Quiz 10. Directions. Read the passage and answer the questions that follow. The Long Night of the Little Boats by Basil Hetter. The following excerpt details events that took place one night in 1940. In the early years of World War II, the British Army was trapped at Dunkirk, France, surrounded by Germans and preparing for a battle they had little hope of winning. Then the night took a surprising turn, as ordinary English civilians took part in a plan to rescue thousands of soldiers. Paragraph 1. They poured out the rivers and harbors and down toward the coast. There were fishing boats, shrimp catchers, ancient car ferries that had never known the touch of salt water. Some had been built before the Boer War. There were bright blue French fishing boats and stumpy little Dutch shouts, large and small, wide and narrow, fast and slow. They moved down to the shore. Some had registered with the Navy and were under Navy command. Others had simply come by themselves. Tubby little crafts used for Sunday picnics on the Thames and laid up for years, somehow gotten under way by elderly gentlemen who had left their armchairs and rocking chairs. Down they came, clogging the estuaries, off to war. Paragraph 2. There are bankers and dentists, taxi drivers and yachtsmen, old longshoremen and very young boys, and engineers, fishermen, and civil servants. There are fresh-faced young sea scouts and old men with white hair blowing in the wind. Some were poor, not even a raincoat to protect them from the weather, and others were owners of great estates. A few had machine guns, some had rifles and old fowling pieces, but most had nothing but their own brave hearts. Off they went at sundown, more than 1,000 boats in all. It was a miracle that so many had been able to assemble at one place at one time, and even more miraculous that crews had been found for them. But now came the best part of the miracle. The sea, as if obedient to suggestion, lay down flat. Ordinarily, the English Channel is one of the roughest places in the world. No place at all for a small boat. But suddenly the wind died, and the seas subsided, and the little boats went out into a calm night. Paragraph 4. By the hundreds they poured forth, coming up from behind them, bent on missions of their own, where the warships, destroyers, cruisers, and gunboats, racketing full tilt toward the coast of France. The moon was not yet up, and in the blackness, for no one dared show a light, the destroyers could not see the little boats, and the little boats could not see the warships until the great gleaming bow waves moving at 40 knots were right on top of them. But somehow, for the most part, they avoided each other, and the strange armada moved on. The wash thrown out by the big ships was a serious matter for the little boats, and they rocked helplessly in the wave of the warships. It was like being on a black highway with fast-moving traffic and no lights showing. A few were rammed and some were swamped, but still they moved on. Behind them, invisible in the blackness, was England. Ahead, glowing faintly from burning oil tanks and flaming artillery, lay the coast of France. Suddenly, out of the night came dozens of aircrafts. Flares dropped by the German bombers, looking like orange blossoms overhead. They lit up a nightmarish scene, wrecked and burning ships everywhere, thousands of British soldiers standing waist-deep in the water holding their weapons over their heads. Hundreds of thousands more in snake-like lines of the beaches, through it all, scuttling like water bugs, moved the little boats, coming to the rescue. As the flares sputtered overhead, the planes came in to the attack. Exploding bombs and ferry tracers added their light to the unearthly scene. Bless me. Through it all, the little boats continued to move into the beach and began taking aboard the soldiers. Paragraph 8. Those who were there will never forget the long lines of men wearily staggering across the beach from the dunes to the shadows, falling into the little boats, while others, caught where they stood, died among the bombs and bullets. The amazing thing was the lack of panic. There was no mad scramble for boats. The men moved slowly forward, neck deep in the water, with their officers guiding them. As the front ranks were dragged aboard the boats, the rear ranks moved up, first ankle deep and then knee deep and finally shoulder deep, until at last it was their turn to be pulled up over the side. Paragraph 10. The little boats listed under loads they had never been designed for, boats that had never carried more than a dozen people at a time, were now carrying 60 or 70. People they backed off the beach remained afloat and ferried their loads out to the larger ships, waiting offshore, and then returned to the beach for more men. As the German gunners on the coast and the German pilots overhead saw their prey escaping, they renewed their efforts. The rain of bombs, shells, and bullets grew even greater until the little boats seemed to be moving through a sea of flame. The strip of beach from Burgese onto the left of Newport on the right was growing smaller under the barrage. Even the gallant rear guard was now being pressed down onto the beaches. The Germans were closing in for the kill. The little boats still went about their business, moving steadily through the water. Paragraph 12. Now the fight was not only against the Germans, but against time as well. The minutes and hours were racing by. Soon the gray light of dawn would be touching the eastern sky, and when it grew light, the German guns and planes would pick off the survivors at their leisure. Every minute counted now. The little boats redoubled their already desperate efforts. Paragraph 13. But all this time, as is to contrast to humanity's frenzy, nature had remained calmed. Although, all through the spring night, the wind had not risen and the sea had remained flat. That in itself was a factor in the saving of countless lives. For if one of the usual spring gales had come whirling through the channel, rescue would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. All through the long hours, the work went on. No matter how many times they made the trip, there were still more men, apparently endless files of weary, stumbling, silent men moving down across the beaches into the water, waiting for rescue. Paragraph 15. At last the ranks of men on the beach grew thinner. The flood that had once seemed endless was reduced to a trickle. Already the sky was growing light, and soon the little boats would have to scuttle away. More abandoned their position. Steadily they went on with the work, although every minute lost might mean another life lost. The men on the beach did not panic. Slowly, steadily, silently, responding only to the orders of their officers, the long line shuffled forward and out into the water toward the helping hands and waited for them on the little boats. When the operation of the little boats was planned, the hope was to rescue about 30,000 men. What the little boats actually did was take 335,000 men off the beach, who then could continue the war against Germany. Number 1. In paragraph 3, how does the author's use of the word miracle impact the meaning of the text? It foreshadows the minimal casualties suffered in the battle. B. It implies there are factual inaccuracies that have been reported. C. It suggests the odds were high that the rescue operation could have failed. D. It introduces the idea that other similar operations were not as successful. 2. What is the effect of the descriptive language in paragraphs 1 and 2? A. It demonstrates how the crisis unified all aspects of British society. B. It illustrates how the English were affected by the war. C. It explains why so many resources were needed. D. It summarizes the specific aid required by the British Army. Number 3. What was the main purpose of using small boats for the rescue operation? A. The small boats were piloted by regular citizens and therefore allowed the British soldiers to do their job fighting the German army. B. The small boats were harder to see at night and thus could more easily avoid the German attacks from the ground and the air. C. The small boats as a group could hold a greater number of soldiers than the bigger boats belonging to the British Navy. D. The small boats could get close to the beach and transfer the soldiers to the bigger boats that had to stay in the deep water. Number 4. Look back at your answer for question number 3. Which quotation from paragraphs 10 to 12 best supports the answer to number 3? A. Boats that had never carried more than a dozen people at a time were now carrying 60 or 70. B. Somehow they backed off the beach, remained afloat, and ferried their loads out into the larger ships, waiting offshore, and then returned to the beach for more men. C. The rain of bombs, shells, and bullets grew ever greater until the little boats seemed to be moving through a sea of flame. D. The strip of beach from Burgese to the left of Newport on the right was growing smaller under the barrage. Even the gallant rear guard was now being pressed down onto the beaches. 5. Which sentence from the text provides the best supports for the central idea of the text? A. Down they came, clogging the estuaries, going off into war. B. Coming up behind them, bent on missions of their own, were the warships, destroyers, cruisers, and gunboats racketing full tilt across toward the coast of France. C. It was a miracle that so many had been able to assemble at one place at one time, and even more miraculous that crews had been found for them. D. It was like being on a black highway with fast-moving traffic, no lights showing. Number 6. How does the author support the claim that the rescuers and the small boats were brave? Use at least 2 details from the story to support your response.